Howdy, partners. It is That History Teacher here with another episode of That History Teacher. This time, we're going to be talking all about Cowboys and Ranchers. And they totally wore face masks before it was cool. Enjoy.
What I want you to do is take a moment and write down what you think describes the image of the cowboy. And then ask yourself, do you think the way you think about a cowboy accurately describes the real life of a cowboy? Write that down real quick. Answer it. Here's your main idea. Cattle ranching is going to be a huge business in the 1860s and 70s. And that's going to be because of the railroads. They provide a new means or a new way to transport those cattle and the meat from those cattle to farther places. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Now, a cowboy wasn't really an American idea, despite what we like to think. First, 1 in 6 cowboys was really Mexican American, or, to be fair, somewhere from Central America. The first cowboys were really Mexican vaqueros, people that had sort of migrated north that were excellent with the cattle and the horses on their ranches in places like Mexico, even Brazil, Argentina, those areas that just moved north. And as they did, they brought to the United States things like the spur, the horn saddle that you see in this picture, and other things that we use regularly with horses. Not all cowboys were the white cowboy that you would see likely in a movie or anything like that. In fact, at least 25% of cowboys were black or African American, and then you also have a fairly high percentage that are going to be Native Americans, Hispanic, things that are not what you would typically see because in pop culture it doesn't get represented very well. We also are going to have a fairly high percentage of girls that are going to be cow people, I guess we should say, that are going to be able to ride, shoot, and ride the trails as well as anybody else. Pictured here is Nat Love, who was a cowboy who ended up writing an autobiography back in 1907, I think it was, where he described it. And so he's going to be one of the famous minority cowboys that we'll see. But there's actually a lot of them. So, if you're ever bored, take a look at the history of what we could consider the atypical cow person and start to think why they're not better represented in the media when we watch movies, TV shows, read books about them. In the 1700s in the United States, and well, what would become the United States, we only have livestock and most materials, goods, products are going to be sold locally. The reason is they didn't have a way to transport, especially fresh food, a long distance and keep it fresh. Same with animals. If you tried to transport animals too far, eventually you would start to lose some to stress that could cause death and things like that. So they didn't have a way to transport them until we had a guy named Joseph McCoy who's going to have a kind of wild and crazy idea. Joseph McCoy's crazy idea is to take his cattle all the way from Texas up to Kansas. So he's going to really drive these Texas Longhorns all the way up to where a railroad station is going to be. Once he can get them on the railroad, he can send them all the way to the East Coast where people will pay a lot more money. And he's not going to have to compete in that small market of Texas. Now he's got a lot better chance of making more money. And eventually other ranchers are going to do this too. They're going to see that possibility for economic growth. And so they're going to go up to different rail stations, Kansas City, Abilene, Dodge City, Pueblo, Denver. And that's where they're going to start putting them on these railroads in what we call cow towns. These long drives were extreme. Imagine about a dozen cowboys with about 3,000 or so cattle. They would have to cross this open range from Texas all the way up to those cow towns in Kansas or Missouri or Colorado. And they would have to watch out for all of these dangers, all of these problems, and keep the cattle safe. even from themselves, stampedes, stepping in holes, and so it was the job of this handful of cowboys to do that. Those dangers included a few things. Swirling dust. If you've ever been in a dust storm, it is blinding, it can be choking. Severe storms. Think of those thunderstorms and tornadoes that can roll through. We are talking about Tornado Alley here. So as they're moving those cattle, you've got hail, you've got all that severe weather that sometimes we just hide inside and wait for a few minutes, but they would be out with zero cover. We've got stampedes. If those cattle start running at you, that's extremely dangerous. Then, if you go in summer, massive heat waves. Imagine it jumping up to 100 degrees with high humidity. And then also, there's cattle rustlers. A cattle rustler is somebody that would steal cattle, so you had to watch out for thieves. So again, this handful, about a dozen or so cowboys, would be in charge of protecting all these cattle from all of these things. When we think of the Wild West, we think of people like Frank and Jesse James, who are pictured here. But really, the Wild West is going to be when those cowboys are going to enter a town, they finally get rid of their cattle, they haven't seen other people besides those other cowboys for a very long time, and they have a lot of money. They're going to go to a saloon, they're going to enjoy a little too much alcohol, and they will have some behavioral issues, as we might say. And when they do, if they need to escape, it's not that difficult. They hop on their horse and they ride, and nobody will want to try to go across the open range to catch them. So, it's not that difficult to see how that imagery is going to show up in our minds. Eventually, the long drives will come to an end. One of the reasons is because there's this thing called tick fever, sometimes called Texas fever, that's going to start to make a lot of the cattle sick, and then people don't want those cattle coming into their states or their territories. Think of it like coronavirus, except with cattle, and they would block off the state. We also are going to see the invention and the widespread use of barbed wire to protect people's private lands that aren't going to allow those cattle ranchers to just sort of wander through with all these cattle eating and grazing, taking their crops, taking their grass, whatever it might be. Some harsh winters are going to absolutely destroy the food that they would eat on their journeys. And we also are going to see people start to grow hay instead of just grass, which means there's even less food for the cattle. If you can't get the cattle to the railroad station safely, then you can't take them. And if they're going to starve on the way, you can't take them. So that's really going to be when the long drives start to end. We're also going to get more railroads spread out throughout the country and into those areas like Texas and New Mexico. So there's even less incentive to take them that far away. We see the image of the cowboy in a lot of places today. We see them in music, not just country music, but actually some of the Christmas songs that you guys sing. That's why I have a picture of Gene Autry. He was known as the singing cowboy. He was an actor. He was a singer. He is going to do the version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Here Comes Santa Claus that you guys probably have heard. He's also going to do a lot of other songs that are very country-ish. We also are going to have a lot of movies and TV shows where we have cowboys, or they sort of take place in those Western themes. We're going to have lots and lots of books. There's an entire series, or an entire genre of cowboy books. A lot of heroes are going to have some cowboy sort of qualities to them. We're going to have legends of cowboys. We enjoy stories about outlaws like Frank and Jesse James. We also are going to have lots of rodeos that you can still go to and have that cowboy imagery still present. So the cowboy idea, even though the open range and the long cattle drives didn't last super long time, less than 100 years, the image of the cowboy keeps going on and on and on. So hopefully you were able to take some of those ideas that you thought about way back at the beginning of this, and you change those ideas just a bit because there's a lot more about cowboys. So, hopefully, you'll take a moment to go and learn a little bit more about cowboys and life in the West.
Well, there you go. I hope you learned something about cowboys and ranchers that you didn't know before. I'm going to ride off into the sunset while you have a wonderful rest of your day. Adios, amigos.